Today we're going to talk a little bit about your pet bird's life. We've given you an introduction to how to have your cage set up for a parakeet and how to have your cage set up for a cockatiel. But today we're going to look at what you can expect from your pet bird when you have a single pet bird. I brought a little parakeet home today, and this little bird had been one that we kept in an aquarium at the store. And because it was in an aquarium, we had already trimmed the feathers on the wing. I wanted to show you first the normal wing on this little parakeet, because our trimming video is on an African gray parrot, which is considerably larger. And you can see the lovely cover feathers at the base of the primary feathers and the secondary feathers. Well, on his right wing, he's actually regrown 2 feathers. They regrow when the cut feather comes out, it actually molts, and then the new feather comes in. And so both of these 2 feathers have regrown. And what we're going to do today is trim that primary and this one right here, so that once again this little parakeet won't be able to fly. You have to do that about twice a year when you have a bird that has its wing trimmed. The other thing I wanted to show you on this little fella, and it is a fella, is how you can tell. And if you look at the cere, if you'd stop chewing my finger, you'd be able to see the cere better. It would be nice. It's actually turning dark blue. This is a relatively young bird. It's just molting in its feathers on its forehead, and so the front of its forehead is nice and clear, but it still has some barring further back. And as that barring recedes, this cere will turn even darker blue, because this little bird is a boy. If your parakeet has a cere where the nostril holes are that is light blue or tan, it's a girl. Now, as babies, they all look the same, and so this one is just beginning to differentiate enough that you can tell it's a boy. When he chews on my finger, yes, it hurts a bit. But I don't tell him it hurts, even though when he gets to my cuticle sometimes it hurts a bit more. I just ignore it, and what you'll see is that after he gets done gnawing for a while, he'll realize that that hasn't caused me to say ouch, it hasn't caused me to do anything else in response to it, and he'll just say, well, this is not worth it anymore, I won't bother. I also brought him home because I thought we'd put him in the cage with our cockatiel. That's actually a very good pairing of birds. Parakeets and cockatiels usually get along together very well. And of all things, the parakeet is usually dominant in the cage. Cockatiels, even though they're larger size-wise, usually will say to the parakeet, okay, I'll do what you say. And we have a number of customers that keep the 2 species together. Not all birds can be combined, and not all species can be combined. But this usually works out very nicely. So I thought it would be fun to put these 2 in a cage together, and you'd be able to see how they go together initially. And I think we won't have any arguments, we'll just have interest. If you look at the cockatiel, you will notice that it has a yellow head at this point. But it's a baby. And what you're looking at on this bird is a pied bird, which means that it is not the original wild color of the cockatiel in Australia. It has extra white, beautiful primary feathers in its wings, and it has all that extra white on its body. Because of that, I cannot tell by looking at this bird, even when it gets older, whether it's a male or a female. The only way I can tell the sex on a pied bird and some of the other color patterns is to listen to their voice. If they do the chirp that you just heard, that doesn't tell me a thing. If it does a long song pattern of doodle-doodle-doodle, doodle-doodle-doodle, why then in fact we're talking about a bird that is a male. And he's trying to decide whether he can push that parakeet out of the way so he can get to the spray millet, because they do both like the spray millet a lot. And the voice that you hear that he's using is, I'm a baby cockatiel, are you a bird that will feed me? Because he's just newly weaned and he's thinking that maybe he's a little confused and that this parakeet is going to feed him as if he were a baby parakeet. I don't think it's going to work, but he's going to try for a minute anyway. So sexing your bird depends on the species. If you have a zebra finch, it's because the male has a red cheek. You can tell it in a normal color pattern. But when you get into mutation colors with many of the birds, you can't really tell by looking. You also can't tell how old they are. These two birds that you see right here, other than the extra banding on the forehead of the parakeet, will look the same when they're each 15 years old. And since we would expect 15 years from a parakeet, why, you're going to have a pretty good looking bird by the time it's 15 years old. Cockatiels, we have one that's 35 years old that shops at the store, and so you've got a nice long lifespan. Rule of thumb is the larger the bird, the longer it's going to live. And so our hyacinth macaw is going to hopefully be around for well over 100 years. I thought we would bring in some feathers because we have talked about trimming feathers, but I also wanted you to see how feathers are in the body and how we deal with them when we're taking care of birds. Feather grows from a follicle. Here's my follicle. And the feather would grow from the follicle, starting out very small and then extending out. When it's growing, it does have a blood supply to it. That blood supply is gone by the time the feather emerges to the level of the cover feathers on the wings. So if you're trimming the wing feathers the way I have shown you, you're never going to have to deal about a feather bleeding. But that doesn't mean that a feather growing in with a blood supply isn't going to bleed if in fact you damage it, or if the bird damages it. And that will happen especially with cockatiels with night fright, where for some reason they just start fluttering around the cage and all of a sudden they break a feather that is growing in, and you get up in the morning and there's blood splattered everywhere. You're sure he's lost a pint of blood. In fact, I've never had a bird that lost enough to be a serious problem. Usually what will happen is when they break the feather way down close to the follicle, the bird will fuss at it and finally pull it. That closes down the follicle, and then there's no more bleeding because it's sealed. The new feather will start to grow, and as it emerges, it'll keep on growing for about 3 weeks until you have a fully emerged feather. With some of the larger birds, like the hyacinth macaw tail feather that we have here, that's going to take more than 3 weeks to get this long. But routinely, they molt their feathers. Their feathers wear out. And so, once or twice a year, you do need to retrim the feathers on the bird to be sure that it won't be able to fly up and away. Another interesting thing about feathers is that if you pull them apart, you can actually zip them back together. If you look with a magnifying glass between the shafts of the feather, the little spines that come out from the shaft, what you will see is something that looks like Velcro. And I urge you all to take a magnifying glass or a low-power microscope and look at one of the feathers. If you have a feather that has down at the base of it, you don't have Velcro-like structures between this part of the feather. That's where the bird has air trapped close to its body, and that's what uses for insulation. The insulation means that it can maintain that high body temperature without wasting energy. It's the same sort of thing that we do by putting insulation in our walls. If we were to fill our walls with down feathers, we'd be nice and toasty warm. So we try to imitate the feathers when we're using insulation. I didn't mention it when we were trimming the feathers, but any scissors works fine for trimming feathers on the wing of a bird. I just want it sharp. This particular pair has rounded ends, and so that makes it something that you won't worry quite so much about because you're not going to poke the little bird. Thank you for visiting.